3 women were sent to the Alpha King. One is buried under a stone with no name on it, because the council decided a name might invite questions. 2 are alive, technically, in the sense that their hearts still beat, and they have not spoken a full sentence since. The healers stopped volunteering after the second one. The council stopped sending candidates after the third. For 11 months, the strongest wolf on the continent lived alone behind a door that 4 men were needed to force open, and even then, only for cleaning. Nobody sent a 4th candidate, nobody had to. A farming girl was sold to cover a tax debt instead, which is a different kind of sentence, and nobody thought to call it a courtship. She was assigned to mop a corridor. She fell asleep on his chest, and that is when the men who could not cage the monster looked at the maid on the floor beside him and understood, all at once, that they had been asking the wrong question for a year. They had been asking how to kill him. What they should have asked is, what does a reasonable man do when the thing he could never leash turns out to have exactly one weakness? And she scrubs floors for a living. The night I fell asleep on the Alpha King's chest, his wolf had already broken 2 women and killed a 3rd that year. I didn't know that yet. What I knew, at the time, was that my feet had stopped being feet somewhere around hour 18 and had become 2 separate arguments I was losing. I want to tell you the morning first, because I've learned that if I don't tell you the good part early, you won't trust me enough to sit through the bad part, and the bad part is most of this story. So, the morning. 40 wolves at the door of a chamber that hadn't opened peacefully in 11 months. His arm locked around my waist like a bar across a gate, heavy enough that I couldn't have gotten up if the granite itself had caught fire, which, given his temperament, was not an outlandish possibility. A healer named Delphine crouched at a distance she clearly considered insufficient, holding 2 fingers to a pulse point on his throat and saying, in the flat, astonished voice of a woman narrating her own disbelief, "That's normal. That's a normal resting heart rate." For the first time in, and then she stopped, because she did the math and didn't like the answer. 11 months. First time in 11 months. I was the only person in that room who wasn't afraid, and I want to be honest with you about why, because false modesty has never once been useful to me. I wasn't brave. I was too tired to generate fear. There's a version of courage that's really just exhaustion wearing a nicer coat, and I have worn that coat more than I'd like to admit. But that comes later. Let me start with the day I became worthless enough to be expendable, because that's the door this whole story walks through. And I've always believed you should show people the door before you drag them through it. My name is Tamsin Holt. Was, at the start of this, 22 years old, from a settlement on the eastern flood plain where we grew barley that the river took as often as we harvested it, and where the tax collector arrived twice a year with a ledger and an expression like he'd rather be anywhere else, which was one of the only things I ever respected about him. The year the river took the barley and the tax stayed the same. My family owed 41 silver marks we did not have. I know the exact number because I watched a man write my name into a column next to it, and I have never, in my life, felt so completely converted into arithmetic. My father argued for 4 minutes. I counted because counting things has always been how I keep my hands from shaking. He offered the plow horse. The collector said the crown didn't want a horse. He offered next year's harvest and the year after. The collector said the crown didn't lend against rivers that might flood again, which was fair, infuriatingly fair, because the crown was right and my father was desperate, and those 2 things can both be true at once, and it doesn't make either of them easier to sit with. On the 4th minute, the collector looked at me, not unkindly. Men who do terrible arithmetic for a living learn to do it without cruelty. The way a butcher learns to be gentle with the animal right up until the part where he isn't. The citadel takes labor against debt, he said. 1 body, unmarried, of age. Domestic service. The debt clears in 4 years. My mother made a sound I still hear sometimes, on nights when the wind does something specific to the shutters. My father didn't argue a fifth minute. I want to tell you I forgive him for that, and somes I do, and some days I count to 4 and feel my jaw tighten anyway. I chipped my front tooth when I was 9, falling off a hay cart my brother dared me to jump from. I run my tongue over the chip when I'm deciding whether to say something unwise. I decided to say something unwise to the tax collector as he loaded me into the cart. 41 silver, I said. Try not to spend it all in one place. He didn't laugh. Nobody laughed for a long time after that. But I'd said it, and saying the unwise thing has always mattered to me more than whether anyone else finds it funny. The road to Ironvale Citadel took 6 days. I spent them learning from a kitchen girl named Orla, who'd made the trip twice before and had opinions about everything. The shape of the place I was walking into. A granite fortress at the spine of a militarized wolf dominion, built by men who understood that walls are a kind of promise and that promises look better in stone. I learned about the East Wing, servant dormitories, thin blankets, a kitchen that fed 400 mouths on a schedule as merciless as any river. I learned about the West Wing. Orla lowered her voice for this part. The way people do when they're about to tell you something that scares them more than they'll admit. Where the Alpha King's chambers had been sealed for 11 months, because his wolf did not recognize doors, or counsel, or mercy, and because 3 women had gone in to try to reach the man underneath and had come out in 3 different kinds of ruin. One's dead, Orla said, buried quiet, no marker, so nobody asks. 2 are. She made a gesture with her hand, a kind of closing, like a shutter latching. They don't talk anymore. Not won't. Can't, I think. Something in them just stopped. I asked what had happened to the wolf, to make it that dangerous, and Orla shrugged in the specific way of someone repeating kitchen gossip she couldn't verify and didn't want to. His father was murdered. Poison, they say, though nobody proved it. Soren took the throne at 17 and held the wolf back through it by sheer will, near as anyone can tell, until 11 months ago, and then it just took over. All the way, like it had been waiting. I didn't know his name meant anything yet. I filed it away the way I filed everything then, information, not investment. I arrived at Ironvale on a morning cold enough to make my breath visible, and I was assigned, within the hour, to floor and corridor work in the East Wing, which suited me fine, because I have never once in my life wanted to be noticed by anyone with the power to unnotice me permanently. Day 1. Day 8. Day 12. I want you to hear those numbers the way I live them. Fast, then faster, the way debt labor days blur into each other until you stop counting mornings and start counting tasks. I scrubbed. I hauled water. I learned which floorboards near the kitchen groaned loud enough to wake the night cook, and avoided them. Because the night cook had opinions about girls who woke her, and those opinions involved extra laundry. On day 12, a steward with a clipboard and the harried look of a man whose actual job had become explain the impossible to people who outrank him, told me I was being reassigned. West Wing. Corridor outside the king's chambers, specifically. Floor and general upkeep. No exceptions, no direct contact expected or permitted. Why me, I said. Because I'd already heard the kitchen intelligence about the 3 women, and I wanted, badly, to understand what particular sin I'd committed to earn this. You're an Omega, the steward said, like that explained anything. Low pack rank. Wolf might not register you as a threat or a... He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, which I noticed and filed away. Or a candidate, I finished for him. He didn't correct me. I want to tell you I refused. I didn't. Refusing wasn't a service the Citadel offered people in my position, and I had learned, by 12 days in, exactly how much say I had over the shape of my own days, which was none, and I had decided, somewhere around day 9, that if I couldn't control what happened to me, I would at least control how I walked into it. I walked into the West Wing corridor the way you walk into cold water, fast, so the shock doesn't get a running start. The antechamber outside his rooms had been, at some point in the last 11 months, a place with furniture. I could tell this from the wreckage the way you can tell us how knows from the shape of the broken glass. A table reduced to kindling in one corner, claw marks, 4 parallel gouges, deep enough to hold a fingertip, raked the full length of one wall, at a height that made my stomach do something complicated when I calculated how tall whatever made them would have to stand on 2 legs. The inner door was ruined too, reinforced with iron bands that had been bent, not broken, which told me something about the difference between his strength and his intention. A door that's been broken has been attacked. A door that's been bent has been leaned on by something that wanted out but didn't quite want out badly enough to finish the job. I mopped the antechamber for 6 days without seeing him. I heard him. Low sounds, mostly. The particular register of something enormous, moving carefully in a small space, which is its own kind of information, because carelessness would have brought the walls down days ago. On the 7th day, the inner door was open 3 inches, which no one had mentioned as a possibility, and through the gap I saw him for the first time. He was on the stone floor, not sitting, not lying, arranged, the way a body settles when it has given up negotiating with gravity. Gold eyes, open, fixed on me the second I came into his line of sight, with the specific stillness of something deciding whether I was worth the energy of a threat. I did not kneel. I want to be very clear that this was not courage. Every account you may have heard implies I looked at the most dangerous wolf on the continent and chose defiance. What actually happened is that I had been on my knees scrubbing grout for 6 days. My knees had filed a formal complaint with the rest of my body, and kneeling again, for him, for no reason I could name, was simply more physical effort than I currently possessed. I stayed standing because sitting down took energy I didn't have, and standing up afterward would take more. He watched me not kneel for the length of time it takes water to boil. Then he made a sound low in his chest, not a growl, something with less threat and more question in it, and looked away first. That was the entire first meeting. I finished the antechamber floor and left. I did not tell anyone. I have never been able to fully explain why, except that some information feels like it will spoil if you say it out loud. Too soon, the way milk turns if you leave it in the light. Before I tell you about the bread, I should tell you what the kitchen already knew about the 3 women who came before me, because I learned it in pieces, over stew and gossip. The way most true things in a citadel get learned, sideways, half-whispered, delivered by people who wanted you frightened enough to be careful, but not so frightened you'd refuse the work outright. The first candidate had been the daughter of a border lord, sent with an escort and a dowry, and every confidence in the world that rank alone would settle a wolf that hadn't recognized rank in months. Orla told me, stirring a pot she didn't need to stir, that the girl had lasted less than a quarter hour, and that what came out of that chamber afterward had needed carrying. She did not say buried. She didn't have to. I understood, from the careful way the kitchen avoided the word, that buried quiet, no marker, was as much detail as anyone was willing to spend on a girl, whose name I never once heard spoken aloud in that fortress, which struck me, even then as its own particular cruelty, that a woman could die trying to reach a king and be erased from the story faster than the wolf itself. The second and third, Orla said, were alive, in the narrow sense the word still permitted. One had been a healer's apprentice with a gift for calming frightened animals, brought in on the theory that a gentle hand might reach where rank had failed. The other had been an omega like me, lower pack standing, sent almost as an afterthought once nobody more valuable could be spared. Neither spoke anymore, not in sentences. Orla described it as something behind the eyes going quiet, like a lamp turned down so low you couldn't be sure anymore whether it was lit at all. I asked her, once, whether she thought I'd end up the same way. She looked at me for a long moment, ladle still in hand, and said, I think you're too stubborn to let anything turn your lamp down, Tamsin. But I also think stubborn girls make the worst kind of martyrs. So mind yourself. It was, I have decided since, the most honest kindness anyone offered me in that entire fortress, delivered with a wooden spoon and no softness at all, which is, I've found, usually how the truest kindnesses arrive. I want to tell you the corridor itself before I go further, because I lived in it long enough that it deserves its own accounting. West Wing stone held cold differently than the East Wing did, denser, older, the kind of cold that settled into the joint of your knuckles and stayed there past midday. The torches guttered more than they should have, always, as though the air itself moved wrong near his door, unsettled by something on the other side of it that didn't breathe the way ordinary air expected. I learned the particular smell of that corridor within days, tallow smoke, old stone, and underneath it, faint and constant, something wilder. Musk and pine and a low animal warmth that had no business existing behind granite, and that I found against every instinct telling me to find it alarming, oddly steadying. The way the smell of a storm coming can be steadying if you've spent your whole life on a flood plain and learned to read weather as information instead of threat. Day 14. There was a heel of bread on the floor just inside the 3-inch gap, placed with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident, squared to the doorframe, like he'd set it down and then adjusted it. I ate my own ration that morning without touching it. I don't know why I left it there instead of eating it or reporting it. I think I wanted to see what would happen if I simply didn't do the expected thing for once and let someone else decide what the silence meant. The next morning it was gone, and there was a second heel of bread beside where the first had been, as though he was testing whether I'd take one for myself if he offered to. I started leaving him a piece of my own ration, deliberately, after that. Not from kindness exactly. I want to resist romanticizing this, because I think that's a disservice to how frightened I actually was, but from the same impulse that makes you leave a door unlocked for a stray animal you haven't decided to trust yet. Small, reversible generosity, the kind you can stop at any moment without having promised anything. Day 19, a folded blanket appeared just inside the gap, squared with the same unsettling precision as the bread. Mine had gone thin with age and citadel laundering. I didn't take it immediately. I stood in the corridor for a long minute, doing the arithmetic of what it would mean to accept warmth from something that had already broken 2 women and killed a third. And then I thought about how cold the East Wing dormitory got after midnight, and I am not, despite everything people have since made of this story, a saint. I took the blanket. Day 22, a pair of wool socks, mismatched, clearly someone's old belongings rather than anything purchased, appeared beside the door. I wore them for 3 days before I let myself wonder whose feet they'd fit before mine, and decided, deliberately, not to ask, because some gifts are kinder if you don't examine their provenance too closely. Day 24, I broke a small rule I'd set for myself without quite noticing I'd set it, and spoke to him directly, through the gap, instead of simply narrating my chores under my breath the way I usually did to fill the silence. "You know," I said, mopping a section of floor I'd already mopped twice that week, because it gave me an excuse to linger. Most men who wanted to court a girl would try flowers before socks. "You've got the order backward." There was a long pause. Then a sound. Not quite a huff, not quite a laugh, something in the narrow country between an animal's amusement and a man's, and I felt, absurdly, a small private triumph at having produced it. Day 26, I heard my name. I want to tell this part carefully, because it's the part people ask me to embellish. And I refuse to, out of some stubborn loyalty to what actually happened, which was smaller and stranger than what people want. I had said my name aloud once, to myself, counting off the days the way I always did. Day 26, Tamsin, get up, a habit from home, talking myself upright in the mornings. 3 days later, through the gap, in a voice that sounded like it had forgotten. It used to be a voice. I heard 2 broken syllables. Tam, sin, not together. A pause between them long enough that I understood he was building the word from a place further away than his mouth. I put my hand against the doorframe. I didn't cry, though I want to be honest that it was close, and closer than I expected, and I've decided not to dwell on it, because dwelling on it makes it bigger than it was, and what it actually was small and quiet and terrifying in the specific way that hope is terrifying when you've trained yourself out of expecting anything. Day 31. There was a wildflower on the floor by the gap. A small blue one, the kind that grows wild on riverbanks in early spring, the kind that has absolutely no business existing inside a sealed granite fortress in the dead of winter. I did not ask anyone how it got there. I pressed it into the pages of a little herbal guide I'd carried from home, between a page on chamomile and a page on willow bark, and I told no one. Some things you keep because sharing them would require explaining them, and I did not yet have an explanation I trusted. By day 39, I had stopped thinking of the assignment as a punishment. That should have worried me more than it did. The 21-hour day started the way disasters usually start, which is to say, it started like an ordinary Tuesday. A supply wagon had broken an axle 2 miles out, and half the East Wing staff got pulled to help unload it by hand in the cold, and the other half got pulled to cover their duties. And I got pulled to cover both, because Omegas rank low enough on the pack hierarchy that nobody thinks to ask whether we're already exhausted before adding to the pile. By the time I reached the West Wing corridor that night, I had been on my feet for 18 hours, and the mop handle had started to feel less like a tool and more like the only thing keeping me vertical. I finished the floor on instinct rather than attention. I remember setting the bucket down. I remember sitting, just for a moment, against the wall beside the 3-inch gap, telling myself I would rest for the length of one breath and then stand. I did not stand. I have gone over what happened next many times, in the retelling. Because everyone wants the mechanics of it. Did he open the door? Did I crawl through it? Whose choice was it? And the honest answer is that I don't fully know. I remember the cold stone at my back. I remember warmth replacing it, immense and sudden, like a wall deciding to become a room. I remember, distantly, the specific comfort of something enormous curling itself carefully, deliberately, around a much smaller thing it had decided not to break. I fell asleep on the Alpha King's chest without ever fully deciding to. I have thought a great deal about why his wolf let me, when it had let no one else within arm's reach in 11 months, and I've come to believe, though I want to flag this clearly as a belief, not a fact, because I'm the narrator here and not a scholar of wolf bond mechanics, that there is a difference between a body that arrives asking for something and a body that simply runs out of road. I never once, in that corridor, over 40 days asked him for anything. I fed him because I had food to spare, and it cost me little. I took his blanket because I was cold, and he'd offered. I never asked to be his anything. I think that mattered more than any of us understood at the time. I woke to 40 wolves at the broken door, and a healer named Delphine narrating her own disbelief to no one in particular, and that is the morning I already told you about, so I won't tell it twice, except to add the part I left out. His arm was locked around my waist, and when I stirred, his whole body went rigid with an alertness that had nothing sleepy left in it, gold eyes snapping open, and for one full second, I watched him decide whether the 40 wolves in the doorway were a threat to me specifically, before he registered that they weren't advancing, and only then did some of the rigidity leave him. He did not let go of me, not for the better part of an hour, while Garrick, his beta, a mountain of a man with scars that told stories he'd clearly rather not repeat, and the peculiar habit of standing in doorways as though his body had simply decided, without asking him, that doorways were dangerous and he should be in them, kept everyone else at a distance with nothing but his own considerable presence, and a look that suggested he'd been waiting 11 months for a reason to hope and wasn't about to let anyone ruin it early. Delphine, crouched at her careful distance, kept up a low, astonished commentary that I found, even half asleep and profoundly out of my depth, quietly hilarious. Respirations steady, steady. In 11 months, I have never… Interesting. Scientists, I've since learned, narrate their own shock the way some people pray. By afternoon, word had reached the council, and the story stopped being a secret between two frightened people in a ruined room and became, instead, an asset, the kind men in fine coats start drawing up plans around before the woman at the center of it has even had a proper meal. I want to pause here and tell you something the retrospective distance of telling this story has given me, which I did not have at the time. Fear and stubbornness have always coexisted in me without either one winning, and that balance has caused more trouble than any single personality trait should be legally permitted to. I was afraid, that afternoon, watching men in council colors murmur to each other in the corridor, while glancing at me like I was a door they'd just discovered had been unlocked the whole time. I was also too stubborn to let the fear show, because I had learned, very young, that showing fear to men who profit from your fear is like handing them a second weapon they didn't have to earn. I did not know yet that the man who'd eventually earn my whole trust would also, on his very first fully human day, make the exact same mistake every man in my life before him had made. I'll get to that. I promised myself I wouldn't get ahead of the story, and I intend to keep that promise, even when it costs me the pleasure of foreshadowing. Lord Halvard Rees came to see me 2 days after the morning of 40 witnesses. So I want to describe him precisely, because the way people imagine villains in stories like this is almost always wrong, and Halvard was never once wrong in the way villains usually are. He did not raise his voice. Not once, in the entire span of this story, did I hear Halvard Rees raise his voice, and I want you to understand that this is not a small detail. The quieter he spoke, in my experience, the worse the news that followed. He was in his 50s, silver at the temples, dressed like a man who understood that expensive plainness reads as more powerful than obvious wealth. He found me in a supply closet doing inventory, which I later understood was deliberate. He liked meeting people in the spaces where they had the least power, so the contrast with his own composure would do half his persuading for him. "Miss Holt," he said, "I understand you've had a remarkable few days." "I mopped a floor and fell asleep," I said. "I'd hardly call it remarkable." "No," he agreed, with the particular gentleness of a man who has already decided the conversation's outcome and is merely walking you toward it. "You're right. It's not remarkable at all, what you did. What's remarkable is what it means." He did not, that day, use the word leash. I want to be fair to the record. That word came later, and it came through a door he thought was closed, and I'll get to it in its place. That day, he spoke only of a controlled continuation of the arrangement, of the Crown's interest in stability, of my unique and valuable position, each phrase softer and more reasonable than the last, and every single one of them, I understood even then, a door being quietly measured for a lock. I told him I had conditions. I have never been entirely sure where I found the nerve, except that I had spent 22 years having conditions imposed on me by men who never once asked what I would trade them for, and something in me had simply decided that this, at least, this one thing, was going to go differently. "No restraints," I said. "No sedation of either of us," and someone tells me his name. His actual name, not the Alpha King. If I'm going to be examined like livestock in front of the Elder Council, I want to at least know what I'm calling him when nobody official is listening. Halvard studied me for a long moment, the particular assessing look of a man revising a figure in a ledger upward. "Soren," he said finally. "Soren Drakmore. His father's was Halbrecht. I served Halbrecht for 30 years, Miss Holt, and I watched him die because he had built no plan for what came after him. I have not made that mistake twice. I didn't understand then that he'd just told me the truest thing he would ever tell me, and that he'd delivered it, as he delivered everything in the softest possible register, as though grief and ruthlessness were the same sentence spoken at two different volumes. The controlled observation, Halvard's phrase, "never mine," took place in the repaired antechamber 3 days later. The councils had replaced the shattered table with a new one, and I remember finding that detail almost unbearably strange. That men who had spent 11 months treating this room as a containment cell had, the moment it became politically useful, suddenly found the budget for furniture. Soren was seated, not on the floor this time, when I entered. Gold eyes tracked me across the room with an intensity that made every wolf standing at the doorway go very still, and I understood, without being told, that stillness in that room was the whole audience holding its breath. He rose, slowly, carefully, the way a man moves when he's relearning the weight of his own height. He crossed to the table, and from beneath it, where someone had apparently smuggled it past a council, too focused on watching me to watch him, he produced a small covered dish and set it down and pushed it toward my side of the table and lifted the covers himself. It was porridge, my kind, flooded plain barley porridge, sweetened the way my mother used to make it, with dried berries folded through. A dish no Citadel kitchen had any reason to know how to prepare, and every reason to have never learned. I understood, looking at it, that somewhere in 11 months of silence he had asked someone, Garrick I'd learn later, through halting effort and half-formed words, to find out what a farming girl from the eastern flood plain ate at home, and that a man who could not yet form a full sentence had performed an act of care specifically, deliberately in my language, before he had any other way left to tell me anything at all. Halvard, seated at a careful distance with a clerk taking notes beside him, observed this with the flat professional interest of a man watching an investment mature. "Remarkable," he said, softly, to no one in particular, and I remember disliking the word intensely, because remarkable was the same word he'd used on me in the supply closet, and I had already learned to hear it as a man totaling a column. I did not cry in front of the council. I want that on the record. I ate the porridge instead, which felt, at the time, like the more honest response. It tasted, I should tell you, exactly right. The particular sweetness of dried summer berries against plain barley, the kind of specific I hadn't had since home, and eating it in front of 40 strangers, who were all quietly deciding what I was worth, felt like the strangest kind of homesickness I have ever experienced. Grief and comfort arriving in the same spoonful. Soren watched me eat the way you'd watch a fire you'd only just managed to light in wet weather, not trusting it yet, but unwilling to look away in case looking away undid it. When I finished, he reached across the table slowly, giving the guards at the door every opportunity to object, and set his hand flat on the wood a careful distance from mine, not touching. Close enough that I understood the offer without needing him to explain it. I put my hand next to his, not on it, and left it there until the observation ended and the room emptied around us, and I remember thinking, with the particular dry humor that has gotten me through worse moments than that one, that I had traveled a very long way from a tax ledger to end up holding still beside a king's hand on a repaired table, and that if anyone had described this to me on the road to Ironvale, I would have laughed them out of the cart. Delphine was the one who named what was happening, 6 days after the porridge, in a small clinical room that smelled of tallow and dried herbs. Holding a page of notes, she kept glancing at as though it might rearrange itself into something less improbable. "His wolf isn't submitting to you," she said, in the tone of a woman narrating her own astonishment because there was no one else in the room qualified to be astonished alongside her. "And it isn't dominating you either. It's doing neither, in every recorded case I have. Everyone, Miss Holt, going back generations. A wolf that dangerous either breaks a woman's will or it's driven off by hers. Yours neither breaks nor resists. You equalize. She set the page down, picked it up again, set it down. That's mate bond territory. The old texts barely dared describe it. Because it's so rare, most healers assumed it was myth dressed up as theory. I asked her, carefully, why me? When 3 women stronger in pack rank standing had been destroyed trying to reach the same door. Because they came in expecting to win something, Delphine said. A crown, a claim, even survival as a kind of victory. You never once asked him to give you anything. You just kept showing up and left when you were done and asked for nothing in return. His wolf had spent 11 months bracing against people who wanted something from him. You're the first thing that walked toward him without wanting anything at all. I left that room with the strange, cold feeling of having been handed the answer to a question I hadn't finished being afraid to ask, and it was in the corridor outside, not 5 minutes later, standing very still beside a door the council apparently believed was soundproof and was not, that I heard Lord Halvard Rees revise his entire strategy aloud, in that same terrible, gentle, unraised voice. Forget the marriage alliance, he was saying, to someone I didn't recognize. Lady Morel Cross, I'd learn, chief envoy from a rival territory, sent originally to angle for exactly the alliance Halvard had just discarded. Aluna shares power. Aluna has claims of her own, obligations to her own line, ambitions that complicate mine. This girl has nothing. No pack rank, no family standing, no leverage of her own to speak of. She's not a Luna candidate anymore, my lady. She's more useful than a Luna ever could be. She's a leash. I stood in that corridor for a long time after they'd finished speaking. And I want to tell you honestly what I felt, because I think the honest version matters more than the dramatic one. I did not feel surprised. I felt the particular cold clarity of having a suspicion confirmed, which is worse than surprise, because surprise at least gives you the mercy of denial for a few seconds first. Lady Morel, for her part, did not argue the point. I heard the small, precise sound of moon-pale gloved hands folding together. She wore those gloves everywhere. I'd noticed, indoors and out, a habit no one had explained to me and I'd stopped expecting explained. And then her voice, considering, recalibrating in real time the way clever people do when a worse plan turns out to serve them better than the good one they'd arrived with. A leash requires a handler willing to hold it, she said. Does she know she's won? Not yet, Halvard said. She will. I understood, hearing that, the shape of the inversion this story had been building toward without my noticing. The monster in the West Wing had never been the danger. I had spent 39 days measuring his cruelty in inches of an open door and finding, each time, less of it than I expected. The danger, all along, wore fine coats and never raised its voice and called itself an accountant of the realm. I want to tell you one more thing about Halvard before the story moves past the point where sympathy for him is still possible, because I promised myself, in the telling of this, that I would not let his softness stand in for a whole person, and a whole person is what he was, whatever else he became. He found me alone once, in the days after Delphine's equalization reports, in the same repaired antechamber, standing at the window because I could not sleep, and the stone floor had become, strangely, the one place in the fortress that still felt honest to me. He did not order me back to quarters. He stood some distance off, hands folded, and after a long silence said, without any of his usual softness, I was in the throne room the night Halbrecht died. 29 years I served him, and in the end I stood 4 feet from his chair and watched a man choke on poison with no named heir he trusted, no counsel prepared, no plan at all, because he had spent his whole reign believing sentiment would sort itself out when the time came. It did not sort itself out. It took 11 years and a war on our northern border to sort itself out. Miss Holt and I buried men in that war. I had trained myself. I swore, over Halbrecht's grave, that I would never again let affection stand between a throne and its succession. I intend to keep that oath. I would ask you not to mistake it for cruelty. It is grief that has simply run out of patience for sentiment. I did not forgive him hearing that. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be a disservice to pretend one speech undid what he'd already set in motion. But I understood him after that night, in a way I hadn't before, understood that the men who build the most careful cages are very often the ones who watched, once, helplessly, while the absence of any cage at all cost them everything, and that understanding a man's reasons has, never once in my experience, obligated you to accept his conclusions. The reassignment came 11 days later, dressed, as everything Halvard did was dressed, in the softest possible language. A border outpost, 3 days' ride, needed additional domestic staff. My unique circumstances made me, the orders explained, a candidate whose safety would be better served by temporary distance from an unstable situation, pending further assessment of the king's condition. I asked directly whether this was Soren's request. The steward who delivered the orders did not meet my eyes. The council's, Miss Holt, for your protection. I want to tell you I refused. I want, badly, for this story to have a version where I stood in that corridor and said no, and it mattered. But refusal, again, was not a service offered to a woman in my position, and I rode out 3 days later, under an escort of 4 silver-armored guards who addressed me with excessive, unnerving politeness, the specific politeness of men who have been told to keep someone comfortable rather than free. I understood, by the 2nd day of the ride, that I was not being protected, I was being removed, deliberately, as an experiment. If Soren destabilized without me, if the wolf reclaimed him the moment I was gone, Halvard would have exactly the proof he needed to declare the throne unfit for its holder and seat a regency in its place. A regency that would, of course, need someone to hold the newly proven leash. The outpost was a squat granite garrison at the edge of contested territory, and my domestic staff duties amounted, within a day, to nothing at all, because nobody there had the faintest interest in my labor. What they had interest in was my location, which was, I came to understand with the particular cold precision Delphine had described in Soren's Wolf, and I now recognized in myself. Exactly the same as being watched. The escort that had ridden with me stayed. Not as guards assigned to a task with an endpoint, but as a presence with no stated departure, stationed at every door I might have used. Polite, patient, permanent. I did not have proof of anything. I had a pattern, and I have learned over the course of this story to trust patterns the way other people trust proof, because by the time proof arrives, it is usually too late to matter. The outpost commander, a tired man named Varen, who I don't believe was ever told the true purpose of my assignment, treated me with a confusion that would have been funny under other circumstances. He assigned me linens to fold and then found, within a day, that his most senior guards had reassigned themselves to corridors nowhere near the linen closet, standing instead outside doors I had no reason to use, at hours I had no reason to be awake. I asked him once, directly, why an Omega folding linens rated 4 dedicated men. Orders from the capital, he said, and had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable saying it, which told me he suspected something he wasn't willing to name. I tested the pattern the way I'd tested everything else in my life. Carefully, incrementally, without announcing that I was testing anything. I asked to walk to the stables for air. Granted, with an escort. I asked to walk to the stables at night instead of midday. Granted, with an escort and a lamp, and a guard who commented, with excessive cheer, on how cold it was for a walk. I asked, on the 5th day, whether I might send a letter home to my family, informing them I was well. The letter never arrived. I know this because I asked, weeks later, and my mother told me, with the particular flatness of someone who has decided not to be angry about a thing she cannot change, that no letter had ever come. That was the morning I stopped calling it protection. Even privately, even in the part of my mind where I was still trying to be reasonable about the men who governed my life. A jailer who is polite is still a jailer. I had spent 22 years mistaking politeness for kindness in men who had power over me, and the outpost, if nothing else, cured me of that particular confusion permanently. The storm rolled in off the northern ridge on the 9th day. The kind of storm that farming children learn to read a full day before it arrives, in the specific greenish weight the sky takes on before it decides to be cruel. I watched it build from the stable yard with something that felt, absurdly, like relief. A storm meant guards who wanted to be indoors. A storm meant the specific human laziness that even careful jailers cannot entirely discipline out of themselves when the alternative is standing in sideways sleet for a woman folding linens. At the Citadel, though I did not witness it myself and can only relate what I was told afterward by Garrick, in his low, careful way, Soren began to come apart within 2 days of my absence. Furniture first, the new table, the one he'd hidden porridge beneath, reduced to the same kindling as the last one. Then the walls, the same 4 parallel gouges reappearing at the same terrible height. Then, on the 4th day, 2 of the guards assigned to his corridor requested reassignment, and Garrick, who had stood in that doorway through 11 original months of exactly this, told the council plainly that the wolf they were watching disintegrate was not proof of instability. It was proof of grief with nowhere to go. Halvard, I'm told, received this report without raising his voice and ordered the outpost assignment extended. I got word out through a courier network I hadn't known existed until I needed it. One of Garrick's people, a stable hand at the outpost, with a face I'd never bothered to memorize because I hadn't yet learned that the people least likely to be watched are often the ones most useful to trust. I gave him 3 lines, no more, because a message that's short is a message that can be memorized and never written down, and written things get found. Tell Garrick I know what the escort is. Tell him the king is not unstable. Tell him I'm coming back. Storm or no storm. And if anyone tries to stop me, they'd better be ready to explain why to the wolf who's currently taking his own citadel apart looking for me. The storm broke the night after I sent it, which I have always privately considered either terrible luck or the floodplain finally repaying a debt of its own, and I used it, because a storm that keeps guards indoors and complaining about the cold is a storm that leaves gaps a farm girl who grew up chasing livestock through worse weather knows exactly how to find. I will not pretend the ride back was heroic. It was cold and long, and I fell off the horse, once in a way I am choosing not to describe in detail, because some indignities are mine to keep. What I will tell you is that I did not at any point during that ride consider turning back, and that this, not the falling asleep, not the porridge, not even the wildflower, is the part of this story I am proudest of, because it was the first time in the entire arc of my life that I chose the danger in front of me instead of enduring the one behind. I arrived at the Citadel gates on the 3rd day of the storm to find them already open, already breached in the sense that the man, the wolf, I could not yet tell which, tearing through the west wing toward them had made the question of locked doors entirely academic. The council had assembled in the courtyard. I want to describe this the way I actually saw it, arriving soaked and half-frozen on a stolen horse, because the retellings since have made it grander than it felt in the moment, and I've promised myself, throughout this whole account, not to let that happen twice. 40 silver spears, leveled, in a ring around a courtyard where snow was still falling sideways. Halvard at the center of the formation, composed, unraised, watching the west wing doors, with the specific patience of a man who has already decided this is, if not the ideal outcome, at least an acceptable one. Because a dead king mourns cheaper in every ledger Halvard had ever kept than a defiant one seated and asking questions about who'd been holding his leash. The doors gave. Soren came through them gold-eyed, enormous, and utterly without the calculation that a rational animal brings to 40 leveled spears, because there was no calculation left in him. There was only the smell of me, finally. After 4 days of nothing, somewhere close enough to reach. I did not think. I want to be honest that this was not the strategic culmination of some plan. I got off the horse, and I walked between the spear points and the wolf, and I put myself exactly where the geometry of the courtyard made it impossible for 40 men to loose their weapons without putting me in the path first. I was terrified. I want that on the record too, because the story people tell afterward makes me sound certain, and I was not certain of anything except that I was tired of being decided about by men who'd never once asked me what I wanted, and that if this was the last unwise thing I ever said with my body instead of my mouth, it was, at least, mine to say. "You are not putting a spear through him in front of me," I said to 40 men, in a voice that shook considerably less than I expected it to. Someone is going to have to explain out loud why that seemed like the reasonable choice. The wolf stopped, not slowly. Not the leaned against a door kind of stopping I'd witnessed for weeks through a 3-inch gap. All at once, the way a held breath releases, gold eyes fixed on me with the particular stillness he'd shown me the very first day, before he'd learned yet whether I was worth the cost of a threat. Then, in front of the entire assembled council, the shift reversed. I have been asked many times to describe what that looked like, and I have never found language equal to it, so I will give you the one detail I trust completely, because I had been told to watch for it, and I did. His left hand flexed twice, an old swordsman's habit of checking a grip that hadn't held a blade in 11 months, and I understood, watching it, that the man underneath had been in there the whole time, waiting for a reason worth the cost of surfacing. He spoke. First full sentences in 11 months, and I want you to hear how simple they were, because I think their simplicity is the whole point of every single thing that had happened up to that moment. "Thames," he said, "move them back, and bring me the ledger with my counsel's letters in it." Garrick, who had clearly been waiting 11 months and 4 days for exactly this instruction, produced the correspondence within minutes. Intercepted. It turned out, weeks earlier, on his own initiative, because a beta who stands in doorways without noticing also, apparently, listens at them. Letters between Halvard and Lady Morell's territory, discussing terms for a regency. Terms for a marriage alliance repurposed into something uglier. Once a leash proved cheaper than a crown. Terms that used the word stability the way Halvard always did, as a soft coat over something with teeth. The word spoken aloud, in front of 40 witnesses, in a courtyard still catching snow, was treason, and I will tell you plainly that I felt nothing like triumph hearing it. I felt tired and cold, and finally, believed. I will give you the breathing moment now, because the story earns it, and I've learned not to withhold relief simply for the sake of drama. They brought us inside to the repaired antechamber, to the same table that had once held smuggled porridge, and someone, Garrick, I think, though he'd deny it, had the sense to put food on it before anyone remembered to ask either of us a single official question. I ate. Soren watched me eat with the specific unhurried attention of a man reassuring himself, meal by meal, that the thing across the table was staying. It didn't last long, that quiet. It wasn't meant to. But I wanted on the record that it happened, because the whole shape of this story is tender things earned by danger, and then shadowed by more danger right after, and I intend to be honest about the mechanism even while I'm living inside it. The shadow came fast, the way it always had. Soren, still hoarse, still relearning the weight of full sentences, turned to Garrick and gave an order that had nothing to do with treason or councils or ledgers. "Take her somewhere safe. Away from all of it. I'll send for her when this is settled." I want to be very clear about what I felt hearing that, because I think it's the truest feeling in this whole account, truer than the fear at the spears, truer than the relief of the porridge. I felt precisely as furious as I had felt, watching a tax collector write my name into a ledger column, watching a steward reassign me without asking, watching a council send me to an outpost for my protection without once inquiring what I wanted protected against. No, I said. The room went very still. The specific stillness rooms develop around omegas who say no to alpha kings in front of assembled councils. I have spent this entire story being decided about, I said, and I did not shake this time, not even a little, because I had run out of patience for shaking. By a tax collector, by a steward, by a council that called an outpost protection. I did not survive 11 months of a door left 3 inches open, so that the very first thing you do, the moment you got your voice back, is decide something about me without asking. I am not somewhere safe. I am not something to be sent. I am the person who walked into 40 spears for you, and I would like, for once, to be asked. He looked at me for a long moment, gold fading fully now, entirely his own eyes, and something in his face did the thing I have since decided is the actual climax of this whole story. More than the shift, more than the spears. He understood. Not agreed, not conceded, understood. The way a man understands a wound he's been carrying without noticing its shape until someone names it precisely. What do you want? He said. To be asked that, I said, before you decide the answer for me, every time, for the rest of however long this is. Then I'm asking, he said. Stay. I stayed. I want you to understand that the word carries less drama on the page than it carried in that room, and I have decided, in the writing of this account, not to inflate it beyond what it actually was. One word, quietly given permission to mean everything, because for once, someone had waited for me to say it first. Halvard's trial, when it came, was as quiet as the man himself. No theatrics, no raised voices, a council chamber and a ledger of his own letters, read back to him in a tone as flat and reasonable as any he'd ever used on me. He did not deny the letters. I want to give him this, because the story asked me, all along, to see him whole and not merely useful as a villain. He had watched Halbrecht die of a succession no one had planned for, and he had spent 30 years afterward converting grief into policy. Believing, with the particular sincerity of men who've mistaken control for care, that he was protecting a throne no one else had the discipline to protect. I am not the villain of this story, Miss Holt, he told me once in that same soft register near the end. I am its accountant. He may have believed it entirely. I have come to think the most dangerous men usually do. Lady Morell's delegation left without ceremony, 3 days after the trial began, her moon-pale gloves the last thing I saw of her from a window, folded neatly as she climbed into a carriage that owed her territory nothing further, and had recalculated in real time exactly how much a failed leash was worth on the open market, which turned out to be very little at all. Delphine sealed her notes on the equalization, at my request and Soren's both, in an archive neither council nor curious healers would touch without express permission. Not because the knowledge was shameful, but because some things, once turned into policy, stop being anyone's story and start being everyone's leverage, and we had both had quite enough of being leverage for one lifetime. I have one confession left, and I've saved it, deliberately, because I promised you at the start that the wildflower would matter, and I intend to keep every promise I've made in the telling of this, even the small ones, especially the small ones. I asked him, once we had time enough for questions that weren't about treason or councils, where a blue riverbank flower had come from, in the dead of winter, inside a sealed granite fortress delivered by a wolf that had, at the time, no words left at all. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer, and then he told me, haltingly, still relearning full sentences, but clear enough that I have never once doubted a word of it, that Garrick had smuggled him a single pressed flower from an old ledger of his mother's, kept from before she died, because in 11 months of silence it was the only gift the wolf recognized as gentle enough to offer a woman it hadn't yet learned to trust with anything sharper. He had not known, giving it to me, whether I would understand it as courtship or accident. He had given it anyway, because some part of him, The man, buried but never entirely gone, had wanted, more than he wanted safety, to be understood by someone who wasn't afraid of him. I told him I'd pressed it into my herbal guide, between chamomile and willow bark, and told no one, because I hadn't yet had an explanation I trusted. "Do you trust one now?" he asked. "I trust you," I said, which was not quite the same question answered, and we both knew it, and neither of us minded. Here is the thing I have learned, in the writing of all this, that I did not know at the start. Being needed and being chosen are not the same thing, and I spent most of my life mistaking the first for the second. Because when you grow up converted into arithmetic by men balancing ledgers, you learn to be grateful for being useful and forget to ask whether anyone ever actually wanted you. Soren's wolf needed me the way a drowning man needs anything solid nearby. It took the man underneath, slower, harder, worth every one of those 40 days measured in inches of an open door, to choose me instead out loud by asking rather than deciding. I spent this whole story measuring a door in inches, 3 inches, most days, sometimes less. I got very good at reading a gap the width of my own hand, and finding, in it, everything I needed to know about whether it was safe to hope. The measuring stopped the day he stopped deciding for me and started asking instead. And I want to leave you with this, because I think it's the only ending this story ever deserved. Some men will spend their whole lives building doors to keep the world out. Reasonably, for your own good, with the softest voices and the best intentions, and call it protection right up until you're the one who has to live inside the room they've built. And some men, once terribly slowly, learn instead to leave the door open 3 inches, and wait, and let you decide for yourself whether to walk through it. I walked through it. I would walk through it again. That's the whole of it. That's why I stopped counting the inches.